Welcome back, guys, to Mr. Cursed. Today, I'm sharing 5 true scary stories from deep in the Appalachian Mountains. These creepy encounters will make you think twice about going into those dark woods alone. But before we start, please hit subscribe and don't forget to like and share this with your friends. Let me know where you're watching from in the comments. I love hearing from you all. Now, let's get started. Back when I was 24, I thought I had life figured out. I'd just gotten my heavy equipment license and landed what seemed like a decent job at Pine Ridge Logging up in West Virginia. The pay was good, better than anything I could find back home in Ohio, and I needed the money. My girlfriend had left me a few months earlier, taking half our stuff and all my confidence with her. Moving to the mountains felt like a fresh start, just me, some machinery, and honest work in the woods. I remember driving up that winding mountain road for the first time thinking this was exactly what I needed. No drama, no complications. Just cut some trees, make some money, maybe find myself in the process. If I'd known what was waiting for us in that valley, I would have turned around right then and never looked back. The crew at Pine Ridge was small, just 6 of us total. There was Joe, our foreman, who'd been logging these mountains for over 20 years. Tough as nails and knew every inch of forest like it was his backyard. Then we had Pete, the sawyer, who could drop a tree exactly where he wanted it every single time. The drivers, Carl and Danny, were brothers who'd been hauling logs since they were teenagers. Rick was our spotter, youngest guy besides me, only 26, and he had this way of reading the forest that impressed even Joe. We were working a new section that fall, deeper into the mountains than Pine Ridge had ever gone before. The company had just bought the logging rights to this untouched valley, and management was excited about the old-growth timber they'd found on the surveys. Some of those trees were easily over 100 years old, worth serious money if we could get them out intact. The first sign something was wrong came on a Tuesday morning. I'd left my excavator parked at the edge of the work site the night before, just like always. When I got there that morning, I found all the hydraulic lines cut clean through, not torn or damaged, cut, like someone had taken a knife to them during the night. "Vandals," Joe said, scratching his beard as he looked at the damage. "Probably some environmental nuts who don't want us working up here." But it didn't feel like vandalism to me. The cuts were too precise, too purposeful, and there were no footprints around the machine, no tire tracks, nothing to suggest anyone had even been near it. We fixed the lines and got back to work, but over the next few days, things kept happening. Carl's chainsaw was found broken in half, literally snapped clean through the middle. Danny discovered his truck's fuel tank had been contaminated with something that made the engine seize up completely. Every morning brought some new delay, some new problem that made no sense. "It's like someone's trying to shut us down without actually confronting us," Rick said one afternoon as we stood around Pete's ruined chainsaw. The blade had been twisted into impossible shapes, metal warped like it was soft clay. That's when I first saw it. I was running the excavator near the tree line, clearing some brush so we could get the bigger machines in, when something caught my eye. At first I thought it was just another tree. There were so many of them, and the shadows played tricks on you in that deep forest. But then it moved. It stood about 8 feet tall, covered in what looked like bark, rough, dark bark that made it almost invisible against the trees. But as I watched, I realized it wasn't bark at all. It was skin. Skin that looked like bark, textured and ridged like it had grown that way over decades. The thing, and I still don't know what else to call it, stood perfectly still for maybe 30 seconds, just watching me work. Then it stepped backward into the forest and vanished. Not ran, not walked away, it melted back into the trees like it had never been there at all. I sat there in the excavator cab, hands shaking, trying to convince myself I'd imagined it. The rational part of my brain was working overtime, coming up with explanations. Trick of the light, shadow patterns, stress from all the equipment problems we'd been having. But deep down, I knew what I'd seen was real. That night at the camp, I mentioned it to the others. Joe just nodded like he wasn't surprised. "Mountains full of strange things," he said. poking at the campfire with a stick. My granddad used to tell stories about things that lived in these woods before people came through. Said some places were sacred and you didn't mess with them. Come on, Joe, Danny laughed. You don't really believe that stuff. But Pete, who'd been quiet all evening, looked up from his coffee. I found something today. Bark stripped off trees in a pattern around our work site, like someone was marking territory. The next morning we found more evidence. Trees all along the boundary of our cutting area had been stripped of bark in deliberate patterns, spirals and lines that formed what almost looked like symbols. The bark was piled neatly at the base of each tree, not scattered like it would be if animals had done it. That thing's smart, Rick said, running his hand along one of the stripped trunks. Look at this. It's using tools, or at least something harder than claws or teeth. We were standing there examining the bark patterns when we heard it, a low, rumbling sound that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Not quite an animal call, not quite human. It echoed through the trees for maybe 10 seconds, then stopped abruptly. The forest went completely silent after that. No birds, no insects, no wind through the leaves. Just dead silence that made my skin crawl. I think we should respect the boundaries, Pete said quietly. Whatever's out there, it's trying to tell us something. But Carl and Danny weren't having any of it. We've got a job to do, Carl said. Company's paying us to clear this whole section, not play games with some forest creature. That's when the real war started. The thing, I started thinking of it as the Guardian, began using our own tools against us. Carl's chainsaw disappeared one night and was found the next morning, having been used to cut down 3 of our transport poles. Danny's truck was found with chainsaw marks carved deep into the hood, forming the same spiral patterns we'd seen on the trees. It was learning from us, studying how we worked, then turning our methods back on us. But it was also showing restraint. It could have seriously hurt us at any point, but it never did. It was fighting back without actually fighting, if that makes sense. The breaking point came when Rick got hurt. He'd crossed one of the marked boundaries to retrieve a fallen branch that was blocking our access road. The Guardian came out of the trees so fast I barely saw it move. It didn't attack Rick directly, but it pushed him hard enough to send him tumbling down a steep embankment. He ended up with a broken arm and some nasty cuts, nothing life-threatening, but the message was clear: stay out of the marked areas. That night, the crew split right down the middle. Joe, Pete, and I wanted to work around the boundaries, respect whatever territorial claim the Guardian was making. Carl and Danny wanted to call in reinforcements, maybe even hunt the thing down. This is ridiculous, Carl said, pacing around the campfire. We're being terrorized by some kind of animal, and we're talking about negotiating with it. But I'd been thinking about it all day, and something had clicked. What if it's not just territorial, I said. What if it's protecting something specific? The next morning, I decided to test my theory. I walked right up to the boundary line but didn't cross it. Instead, I sat down on a fallen log and waited. Sure enough, after about 20 minutes, the Guardian emerged from the trees. It approached slowly, stopping about 50 feet away. Up close, it was even more unsettling. Its bark-like skin was constantly shifting, subtly, changing texture and color to match the forest around it. Its face was almost human, but wrong in ways I couldn't quite identify. The proportions were off, the angles too sharp, the eyes too large and too knowing. We stared at each other for what felt like hours, but was probably only a few minutes. Then I stood up slowly and pointed past the boundary deeper into the forest. The Guardian turned to look, then back at me. I pointed again, then tapped my chest and shook my head. The Guardian tilted its head, considering. Then it turned and walked deeper into the forest, stopping every few steps to look back at me. I followed, staying carefully on my side of the marked boundary. It led me to a grove of ancient trees that must have been growing there for centuries. They were massive, their trunks wider than my excavator, their canopy so thick it blocked out most of the sunlight. In the center of the grove was a natural spring, crystal clear water bubbling up from deep underground. This was what it was protecting. Not just territory, but a sacred place, something that had been there long before Pine Ridge logging, long before the roads and the equipment and all of us. I understood then. The guardian wasn't just some territorial animal. It was a keeper, a protector of something ancient and important, and we'd been threatening to destroy it without even knowing it existed. When I got back to camp and explained what I'd found, even Carl and Danny had to admit it changed things. We drew up a new plan that would log around the sacred grove, leaving a wide corridor untouched. It meant less timber, less money, but it felt like the right thing to do. The guardians seemed to accept our compromise. The next morning we found that all the boundary markers had been moved, creating a clear path around the protected area. More than that, it started helping us. It would appear at the edge of our work site and point out dangerous trees, unstable ground, anything that might hurt us if we weren't careful. It was like having the world's most knowledgeable forest guide, one that knew every inch of those mountains and genuinely wanted to keep us safe. Of course, the company didn't see it that way. When we reported back about the modified logging plan, management hit the roof. They threatened to fire the whole crew if we didn't stick to the original boundaries. They sent up a supervisor to make sure we were following orders. That supervisor lasted exactly 1 day. The guardian made sure of that. Nothing dangerous, just enough strange occurrences, tools moving on their own, his truck radio playing voices that shouldn't have been there, his GPS leading him in circles, that he packed up and left before nightfall. Word started getting out about what was happening at Pine Ridge. Environmental groups caught wind of the story, and before we knew it, there were reporters and activists showing up. The company tried to keep it quiet, but once the media gets hold of something like this, there's no stopping it. The legal battle lasted months, but eventually the sacred grove was designated as protected habitat. The state stepped in and modified the logging rights, creating permanent boundaries that matched almost exactly what the guardian had originally marked. We finished the job that winter, working in partnership with something that should have been our enemy. The guardian never fully trusted us. It kept its distance, watched everything we did, but it also protected us. There were times when it would appear just before bad weather hit, giving us enough warning to get to safety. Once, it led Rick away from a tree that looked perfectly healthy but fell 10 minutes later, right where he'd been standing. I still work in logging, but I never went back to those mountains. And not because I was scared, well, not entirely because I was scared, but because I felt like I'd been part of something I didn't fully understand, something that was bigger than just cutting trees and making money. Sometimes late at night when I'm lying in bed, I think about that guardian and wonder if it's still out there, still protecting that sacred grove. I hope it is. The world needs more protectors, more things that care about places and preserve them for reasons that don't have anything to do with profit or progress. I learned something important in those mountains. There are things older than us, things that were here before we came and will probably be here long after we're gone. And maybe, if we're smart enough and humble enough, we can find ways to coexist with them instead of just destroying everything we don't understand. The other guys from the crew still stay in touch. Joe retired a couple years ago and moved to Florida. Pete started his own small logging operation, focuses on sustainable practices. Carl and Danny are still running trucks, though they tell people they won't work certain areas of the mountains anymore. Rick got into environmental consulting, helps logging companies identify sensitive areas before they start cutting. We don't talk much about what happened at Pine Ridge, not because we're ashamed of it, but because it feels too important to turn into just another story you tell at bars. Some experiences change you, and you carry them quietly, like secrets that shaped who you became. I'm 31 now, married to a woman who understands why I sometimes stare off into the distance when we drive through forest areas. She knows there's something I experienced that I can't fully explain, and she doesn't push me to talk about it. That's love, I think. Accepting that the person you care about has depths you might never fully understand. But on nights like this, when the wind is moving through the trees outside our house and the world feels full of possibilities I can't quite name, I remember what it felt like to stand at the edge of something ancient and powerful, something that demanded respect instead of fear. And I'm grateful I was smart enough to listen. Back when I was still working the pizza delivery job, I was 27 and barely keeping my head above water. Emma was 8 then, and her mom had been gone for 3 years by that point. Took off to California with some guy she met online. Left me with a kid, a trailer payment, and a credit score that made landlords laugh. The pizza place paid minimum wage plus tips, but the real money came from what we called mountain runs. Deliveries way up in the hollers, where folks had enough money to pay triple just to get hot food delivered to their cabins after midnight. I'd been doing those runs for about 8 months when I got the call that changed everything. It was a Thursday in late October, the kind of night where the fog rolls down from the ridgelines and sits heavy in the valleys. Emma was at my sister's place for the weekend, and I was pulling a double shift to make rent. Around 11:45, the phone rang at the store. "Gino's Pizza," I answered, already grabbing a pen. "I need 2 large pepperonis delivered," the voice said. Older guy, sounded educated, not the usual mountain accent. "Address is 1247 Kettle Creek Road. I'll pay triple rate plus a $100 tip if you can get here before midnight." $100 would cover Emma's school pictures and her field trip to the Science Museum. "Yes, sir, I can do that. Credit card?" He rattled off the numbers, and everything checked out. I loaded up the pizzas and headed out in my beat-up Civic, taking Route 19 north toward the real remote stuff, the kind of area where families have lived on the same land since before the Civil War, where the old mining families built their big houses back when coal was king. About 15 minutes up Kettle Creek Road, my phone lost signal completely. Not unusual up there, the mountains play hell with cell towers. But then my GPS went dark too, and that had never happened before. The SKR. Ian just went black, like something had drained the battery, even though I'd charged it at the store. I kept driving, figuring I'd find the address eventually. These old mountain roads all connect somehow, and most of the houses up there are marked with those green reflective number signs. But the deeper I went, the stranger things got. The fog was so thick I could barely see my own headlights reflecting back at me. And it was quiet in a way that made my skin crawl. No insects chirping, no owls calling, nothing. Just the sound of my engine and the crunch of gravel under my tires. Then my car started making this grinding noise, not the belt squealing. Something deeper, like the transmission was eating itself. I pulled over near what looked like an old logging trail and tried to restart it. The engine turned over fine, but that grinding noise was still there, coming from underneath the car in a rhythm that almost sounded deliberate. That's when I saw the driveway. It was barely visible through the fog, 2 ruts in the grass leading up to a cabin maybe 100 yards back from the road. No mailbox, no number, but there was smoke coming from the chimney, and I could see the faint glow of lamplight in the windows. I grabbed the pizzas and my flashlight and started up the drive. The air changed as soon as I stepped out of the car. It felt thick, almost oily, like breathing through wet wool. My work boots squelched in mud that hadn't been there on the road. And that quiet, it was so complete it made my ears ring. I remember thinking how my footsteps sounded too loud, like they were echoing off invisible walls. I knocked on the front door and waited. Nothing. Tried the doorbell, old mechanical type that should have made that ding-dong sound. But it was silent. I walked around the cabin, checking for other entrances. The customer had paid with a valid credit card, so I wasn't worried about getting stiffed. But I also didn't want to drive all the way back with cold pizzas if he was just in the bathroom or something. That's when I found the backyard. Dawes. First, I thought it was some kind of art installation. 20 or 30 white sculptures arranged in a perfect circle, each one about 4 feet tall. They looked almost like abstract representations of trees, tall, curved, with these delicate branching structures at the top. In the beam of my flashlight, they had this bone-white gleam that was almost beautiful. But as I got closer, I realized what I was looking at. They weren't sculptures, they were human spines, perfectly preserved and somehow made to stand upright. Each one still had the skull attached at the top, creating those branching structures I'd mistaken for artistic flourishes. The vertebrae were intact, held together by what looked like surgical wire, and at the base of each spine was a small brass plaque. Margaret Hollis, age 34, October 12, 1987. James Chen, age 29, March 3, 1994. Sarah Martinez, Age 31, July 18th, 2003. Real names, real dates, going back decades. I should have run. Should have dropped those pizzas and gotten the hell out of there. But when you see something that completely breaks your understanding of reality, your brain locks up trying to process it. Maybe they were medical specimens, I told myself. Or really elaborate Halloween decorations. Rich people do weird stuff with their money. Behind the spine circle, built into the hillside, was one of those old-style root cellars. Heavy wooden doors set at an angle into the ground, like a storm shelter. The doors were standing open, and there was yellow lamplight coming from inside. Against every survival instinct I'd ever had, I walked over and looked down. The smell hit me first, formaldehyde mixed with something organic and rotting. The stone steps led down to a workshop carved directly into the rock, like an old mine shaft that someone had converted. Along the walls were glass jars filled with yellowish fluid and floating ends. Those jars were more spines, carefully labeled with dates and anatomical notes. But it was the surgical table in the center that made my hands start shaking. It was one of those old-fashioned operating tables, the kind you see in medical museums, but it had been modified with restraints. Leather straps at the wrists, ankles, chest, and forehead. Next to it was a cart full of surgical instruments, bone saws, spinal taps, something that looked like a medieval torture device but was probably used for separating vertebrae. On a workbench near the stairs, I found the journal. It was bound in what I hoped was leather, filled with precise handwriting in black ink. The first entry was dated March 15, 1975, and it explained everything in clinical, methodical detail. The author called himself Dr. Matthias Bone, probably not his real name, and he'd been collecting human spines for a ritual he called the Awakening Sculpture. According to what he'd written, he needed exactly 100 perfectly preserved adult spines to create a bridge between the living world and the realm of eternal hunger. The ritual had to be completed during a new moon in winter, when the barriers between worlds grow thin. He had detailed anatomical drawings showing how to remove a spine while keeping the victim conscious and alive for as long as possible, because the essence of life must be present during the extraction for the preservation ritual to work. I flipped through pages of surgical notes, preservation techniques, victim profiles. He preferred healthy adults between 25 and 40 with no prior spinal injuries. He'd been taking 1 or 2 people a year for 3 decades, always from different counties, always people who wouldn't be missed immediately. Drifters, runaways, people like me who worked late-night jobs alone. Near the back of the journal, the entries became more frantic. According to his count, he had 97 spines. He needed 3 more, and the next new moon was in 5 days. He was getting desperate, taking risks, accelerating his timeline. The most recent entry was dated that morning. Pizza delivery scheduled for 11:45 p.m. Driver profile indicates single father, financial difficulties, unlikely to be missed until Monday. Perfect spinal curvature observed during reconnaissance. Subject will be spine number 98. That's when I heard the footsteps above me. They were coming from inside the cabin, moving slowly and deliberately from room to room. I clicked off my flashlight and crouched behind the workbench, trying not to breathe. The footsteps stopped at what must have been the back door, then started moving across the yard toward the cellar entrance. I stuffed the journal under my jacket and looked for another way out. There wasn't one. The only exit was up those stairs, and something was coming down them. I could see a shadow moving against the lamplight, getting bigger as it descended. What came down those stairs wasn't entirely human anymore. It had been once, maybe. Tall and thin, wearing what looked like a doctor's coat stained with decades of blood. But its arms hung too long, and its fingers had been surgically extended with metal implements, scalpels, bone saws, needles, fused directly to the bone. Its face was pale and waxy, like it had been preserved with the same chemicals it used on its victims. When it smiled, I could see that it had replaced its own teeth with perfectly filed vertebrae from its collection. It looked at me with the calm confidence of a surgeon preparing for a routine operation. When it spoke, its voice sounded like it was coming from underwater. "Subject appears to be in excellent health," it said, tilting its head to examine my posture. "Spine curvature is optimal. This will make a beautiful addition to the circle. It reached into a bag and pulled out a modified dart gun. But instead of firing immediately, it paused, savoring the moment like a wine connoisseur about to open a rare vintage. That hesitation saved my life. I grabbed a jar of preservation fluid from the nearest shelf and hurled it as hard as I could. The glass exploded against its chest, and the chemical ate through the doctor's coat like acid. It made this sound, not quite human, but close enough to be disturbing, like someone screaming while drowning. I ran for the stairs, but something hit me in the back before I made it halfway up. Not the dart, something heavier and sharper. A bone saw, thrown with surgical precision, had embedded itself between my shoulder blades. I could feel the blade scraping against my spine as I pulled it out. The thing was coming up the stairs behind me, moving with that horrible, deliberate pace, like it was performing surgery. I stumbled up and out of the cellar, slamming the wooden doors behind me and jamming an old piece of rebar through the handles just as something started pounding from below. That's when I noticed something that probably saved my life. Each of the spine sculptures had a small copper wire running from its base to a central point in the circle. They were all connected somehow, and that central point was connected to the cellar by another wire running along the ground. It was some kind of electrical circuit, with the spines acting as conductors for whatever ritual energy the thing was trying to harness. I pulled out my Zippo and lit a page from the journal, then touched it to the copper wire. The effect was immediate. Every spine in the circle started to glow with this sickly green light, and I could hear the thing below screaming as the cellar doors bulged outward. The wire was conducting something more than electricity, something that burned like acid against my fingers when I touched it. The cellar doors exploded open. The creature that came out was different now. The preservation chemicals that had kept it functioning for decades were aching down, and I could see its real age showing through. Its skin was gray and brittle, cracking like old leather. It moved toward me, but it was stumbling now, losing that surgical precision. I kept burning pages from the journal and touching them to different parts of the wire circuit. Each time I did, another spine would crack and split, and the creature would get weaker. But it was still coming, still trying to reach me with those metal-tipped fingers. When I touched the flame to the central connection point, the entire circle went up like a fireworks display. The spines didn't just burn, they screamed. Each one released this high-pitched wailing sound as the trapped essence of whoever it had belonged to was finally set free. The creature collapsed to its knees as the circuit overloaded, and I watched its preserved flesh start to crumble like ancient parchment. 100, it whispered, reaching toward me with one last desperate grab. So close to 100. Then it crumbled to ash, leaving nothing but a pile of bone fragments and rusted surgical instruments. I ran into the woods and didn't stop until dawn. I followed old deer trails by moonlight, stumbling through underbrush and creek beds until I found a state highway. A trucker picked me up around 6 a.m. and drove me back to town, where I told the police I'd been in a car accident and wandered around lost all night. The paramedic who stitched up my back said the wound looked like it came from a surgical instrument, but I stuck to my story about falling on a broken tree branch. When the police went back to investigate, they couldn't find the cabin. Not the driveway, not the spine circle, not even Kettle Creek Road itself. The GPS coordinates I'd written down led to an empty field that had been logged 20 years ago. My car was found parked on Route 19 with a dead battery and a cracked engine block that the mechanics said looked like it had been deliberately sabotaged from underneath. But here's the thing that still keeps me awake at night. 3 weeks later, I was reading the Missing Persons reports, something I'd started doing obsessively since that night, and I found Margaret Hollis, James Chen, and Sarah Martinez. All of them had disappeared exactly on the dates I'd seen on those brass plaques. Margaret was a nurse from 2 counties over who vanished after her shift at the hospital. James was a traveling salesman whose car was found abandoned on a mountain road. Sarah was a social worker who'd been making a home visit to a remote client. All of them had been listed as missing persons, never found. Their families had spent decades wondering what happened to them, and now I knew, but I could never tell them because who would believe it? I quit the pizza delivery job the next week, took a position at Johnson's Hardware in town. Regular hours, decent pay, no late-night mountain runs. Emma asks me sometimes why I won't take her camping in the state parks anymore, or why I get nervous when she wants to go on overnight field trips. I tell her I'm just being overprotective, but the truth is I'm scared of what else might be out there in those remote places, waiting for someone desperate enough or unlucky enough to find them. The nightmare started about a month later. Always the same. I'm back in that cellar, but this time the creature succeeds in getting me on that surgical table. I can feel the bone saw starting to work, and I wake up with the taste of formaldehyde in my mouth. Dr. Peterson, the psychiatrist I started seeing, says it's PTSD from the car accident, but he doesn't understand why I keep mumbling about spines in my sleep. I've developed what Emma calls weird habits since that night. I check and double-check locks on doors and windows. I won't go anywhere without my cell phone fully charged and a backup battery pack. I installed a security system in our apartment that would make Fort Knox jealous, and I've started carrying a Esme, a bottle of lighter fluid and a Zippo everywhere I go, though I can't explain to Emma why Daddy needs to have fire available at all times. The worst part is the doubt. Did I actually destroy that thing, or did I just interrupt its ritual? The journal mentioned other collectors working towards similar goals, other doctors and sculptors gathering their own materials for their own rituals. Maybe what I found in Dead Man's Hollow was just one workshop in a larger network. Sometimes I wonder if there are other people out there like me. Delivery drivers, service technicians, repair workers, people whose jobs take them to remote places where things like Dr. Bones set up their operations. And sometimes I wonder if those people survived their encounters, or if they became spine number 98, number 99, and number 100 for some other collector who was better prepared. I still check the missing persons reports every week. When someone disappears from a remote area, especially someone who worked a job that took them to isolated locations, I wonder if they found something they shouldn't have, or if something found them. Emma's 15 now, and she's starting to ask harder questions about why we moved to town, why I won't let her get a job that involves driving to customers' houses, why I always know exactly where she is at all times. She thinks I'm being paranoid, and maybe I am. But I've seen what's out there in the dark places, and I know that sometimes paranoia is just another word for survival instinct. The thing that haunts me most isn't what I saw that night. It's the math. Dr. Bone had been collecting for 30 years, and he only needed 100 spines for his ritual. That's about 3 people a year from a region with hundreds of thousands of residents. How many other collectors are out there working at the same slow, methodical pace? How many other workshops are hidden in cellars and abandoned mines throughout Appalachia? And how many of them have already reached 100? Last week I found a news report about a family of hikers who disappeared near the West Virginia border. Their camp was found intact, but there were no signs of struggle, no blood, no tracks leading away from the site. Just 3 empty sleeping bags and a campfire that had been carefully banked, as if whoever put it out wanted to preserve the wood for later use. The search was called off after 2 weeks. The official report listed them as presumed dead due to exposure. But I know better. Someone out there is still collecting, still building their bridge between worlds. And sooner or later, they're going to finish what Dr. Bone started. I just hope when that day comes, I'm far enough away to avoid becoming spine number 101. I'm 28 years old, and I still can't drive past Mirror Lake without my hands shaking on the steering wheel. Back in 2013, I was working maintenance at the resort there during the off-season. It was supposed to be easy money, just me and my boss Frank keeping the place running through winter, checking pipes, fixing whatever broke from the cold. The pay was decent, and honestly, I liked the quiet. Most people think being alone in the mountains would drive you crazy, but I'd grown up in those hills. The silence felt normal to me. Frank had been managing that place for 15 years. He knew every pipe, every electrical box, every creaky board in the main lodge. Guy could fix anything with duct tape and determination, and he had this habit of naming all his tools. Called his favorite wrench Bertha and his drill Little Pete. Weird maybe, but Frank was reliable. He'd show up every morning at 7 sharp with coffee from town, and we'd walk through our checklist together before splitting up to handle different buildings. The resort sat on about 40 acres, with the main lodge right on the water and maybe 20 cabins scattered through the trees. During summer, the place was packed with families from Charlotte and Atlanta. But come November, it was just us, the lake, and about 1,000 acres of state forest. The nearest neighbor was 5 miles down a gravel road that turned to mud every time it rained. Cell service was spotty at best, and the landline in the lodge was older than I was. I should have paid attention when Frank started acting strange. It was subtle at first, little things that didn't quite add up. He'd ask for tools by the wrong names or forget conversations we'd had the day before. I figured maybe he was stressed about something at home. His wife had been sick the year before, and maintaining a place that size during winter was exhausting work. And Frank showed up to work one morning and couldn't remember how to start the generator. This was a man who could rebuild that thing blindfolded, and he was staring at it like he'd never seen it before. When I asked if he was feeling okay, he just smiled. But it wasn't quite Frank's smile. Something about the way his face moved didn't look right. Too stiff, maybe, or like he was thinking too hard about how to make the expression. That's when the second Frank walked in. I was standing there trying to explain the generator controls to who I thought was Frank when I heard the lodge door slam. Heavy boots on wooden floors, and then Frank's voice calling out, "Bobby, where you at, son?" I turned around, and there was Frank. The real Frank, I mean. Same flannel shirt, same work boots, same coffee mug with the chip on the handle. But the thing is, Frank was already standing right next to me. I looked back and forth between them, and I swear to you, they were identical. Same face, same clothes, same everything. But the Frank who'd been with me, the one who couldn't work the generator, he was standing perfectly still. Too still. Real people don't stand that still. Real Frank walked over and looked at the other one, and I watched his face go through about 6 different emotions in 2 seconds. Confusion first, then fear, then something that might have been anger. "What the hell is this?" he said. But he was asking me, not the other Frank. That's when things got bad fast. The fake Frank. Because that's what it had to be, right? It tilted its head like it was listening to something I couldn't hear. Then it opened its mouth, and Frank's voice came out. But the words didn't match the way its lips were moving. "Bobby knows," it said. "Bobby sees." Real Frank grabbed my arm. "We need to leave, right now." But fake Frank moved between us and the door. It was still wearing Frank's fad. Key, but something was wrong with the skin around its eyes. Too smooth, maybe. Like plastic that hadn't been painted quite right. "Where are you going, Frank?" it asked, and now its voice sounded like mine. "We got work to do." That's when real Frank picked up the crowbar from his tool belt and swung it at the thing's head. The sound it made when the crowbar connected, I still hear it sometimes when I'm trying to sleep. It wasn't the sound of metal hitting bone. It was more like hitting a garbage bag full of wet sand. And the fake Frank didn't fall down like a person would. It just sort of folded in on itself, and its face started coming apart. The skin around its cheeks was peeling away, and underneath wasn't muscle and bone. It was something gray and wet, like the inside of a mushroom. But it was still trying to talk, still using our voices. "Bobby," it said in Frank's voice. "Frank," it said in mine. Real Frank grabbed my shoulder. "Move your ass, boy!" We ran for the door, but when we got outside, there were more of them. 3 people in maintenance uniforms just like ours, walking up from the direction of the lake. They all had our faces. I don't remember much about running through those woods. Frank knew some old logging trails, and we followed them until we got to his truck, parked about a mile from the main road. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely get my seatbelt on. "What the hell were those things?" I asked. Frank was already on his radio trying to reach somebody, anybody, in town. All he got was static. "I don't know," he said, "but they've been studying us, learning how to be us." That's when we met Carmen. She was pulled over on the side of the road, hood up on her delivery truck, looking frustrated and scared. Carmen delivered groceries to the resort once a week during off-season, and she'd been doing the route for 2 years. Sweet girl, Always had a joke or a story about some customer in town. But Carmen was staring at her delivery receipts like they were written in a foreign language. "You guys see anything weird at the resort today?" she asked when Frank pulled over to help. Turned out Carmen had made the same delivery 3 times that morning. Same person, same cabin, but they'd ordered completely different groceries each time. First it was just milk and bread. Then it was meat and vegetables. Third time was nothing but candy and soda. And each time the person looked exactly the same, but they paid with the same credit card and signed 3 completely different names. "The last one," Carmen said, "when I handed him the receipt, his hand felt wrong. Cold, you know, and soft, like putty." She held up her own hand, staring at her palm like she could still feel it. I looked at his fingers, and I swear the fingerprints were too shallow, like they'd been drawn on. That's when Frank told her what we'd seen at the lodge. Carmen went quiet for a long time. Then she said, "I think I know where they're coming from." She led us to the back of her truck and pulled out a clipboard with her delivery records. "Look at this," she said, pointing to entries from the past 3 months. "I've been delivering to the same people, but the orders keep getting stranger, like they're trying to figure out what normal humans eat, but they don't quite understand." "And there's something else," she said. "Last week I had to use the service entrance because the main road was blocked. Went around to the back of the main lodge near the loading dock. There's a big industrial freezer back there, right?" Frank nodded. He knew every piece of equipment at the resort. Well, it was running. Middle of winter. Nobody's staying there, but that freezer was humming like it was working overtime. And there was this smell coming from the ventilation grate. Sweet, but wrong. Like fruit that's gone bad, but also... She made a face. Like wet leather. Frank looked at me. "We never checked the kitchen freezers. They're supposed to be shut, down for winter." I didn't want to go back there. Every instinct I had was screaming to get in that truck and drive until we hit the interstate. But Carmen was right. We needed to know what we were dealing with. And that's when Janet showed up. She pulled up in a state vehicle just as we were trying to figure out our next move. Janet was a health inspector for the county, maybe 35, with the kind of no-nonsense attitude that comes from dealing with restaurant owners who think regulations are suggestions. "Y'all work at the resort?" she asked, getting out of her car with a clipboard and an official-looking badge. Turns out Janet had gotten complaints about unusual activity at Mirror Lake during the off-season. People in town reporting multiple sightings of resort employees in places they shouldn't be, at times when the resort was supposed to be closed. Someone had called the health department saying they'd seen food deliveries happening when no guests were registered. "I'm here for a surprise inspection," Janet said, "and I'm hoping you can explain why your permits show signatures from people who don't exist." Frank looked confused. "What do you mean?" Janet pulled out a folder. "Health department has applications from your resort signed by a Robert Martinez and a Carol Stevens. But according to your employment records, nobody by those names has ever worked there." I felt something cold settle in my stomach. "Janet," I said, "I think you need to hear what we just saw." So we told her. All of it. The fake Frank, the delivery duplicates, everything. I expected her to think we were crazy, but instead she got very quiet and started taking notes. "That explains the handwriting analysis," she said finally. "We sent those signatures to an expert because something felt off. Turns out they were all written by the same person, but they were trying to disguise their handwriting each time. Like someone practicing different people's signatures until they got them right." Janet made a decision that probably saved our lives. Instead of going to the resource or alone for her inspection, she asked us to come with her. "If there's really something dangerous there," she said, "I'm going to need witnesses." We went back as a group, and Janet's official authority got us into places I'd never seen before. There was a basement level under the main lodge that I didn't even know existed. Frank had been working there for 15 years, and he'd never seen it either. That's where we found the collection. Room after room of personal belongings, driver's licenses, credit cards, family photos, jewelry, hundreds of them, maybe thousands, organized in plastic bins like someone was running a very methodical operation. And all the IDs were from people in the surrounding counties. Not just our area, but places up to 100 miles away. "Jesus Christ," Frank whispered, picking up a driver's license dated 1987. "They've been doing this for decades." But the worst part was the basement freezer. Janet opened it with her master key, and the smell that came out made all three of us step back. It wasn't just the sweet, rotten smell Carmen had noticed. It was organic in a way that made your brain want to shut down rather than process what you were seeing. The freezer was full of cocoons. I don't know what else to call them. They looked like giant seed pods, maybe 7 feet long and 3 feet wide, made of something that looked like wet tree bark but felt warm to the touch. And they were moving, slowly, like something was breathing inside them. Through the translucent parts, we could see shapes, human shapes. Carmen made a sound I hope I never hear again and backed toward the door. But Janet, God bless her, she stepped closer and started examining them like the scientist she was. "Look at this," she said, pointing to tubes that ran from each cocoon down into the floor. "Some kind of nutrient system. And these wires." She followed a bundle of organic-looking cables that disappeared into the wall. "They're connected to something." Frank found the master switch. When he flipped it, lights came on throughout the basement, and we could see the full scope of what we were dealing with. The entire basement was connected by these organic cables, hundreds of them, running through the walls like veins, and in the center of it all was something that looked like a cross between a computer server and a giant brain. That's when we heard the footsteps upstairs. Multiple sets of footsteps, walking around the main floor in perfect synchronization. And voices, our voices, calling our names. "Bobby, Frank, where are you boys?" "Janet, your inspection's not finished." "Carmen, honey, you forgot something in your truck." Frank looked at the organic computer thing in the center of the room. "That's how they do it," he said. "That thing stores all the memories, all the personality stuff. Cut the connection, and the copies stop working." It was Carmen who figured out how to destroy it. She found an axe in the maintenance room and started chopping through the main cables. Soon as she cut the first one, we heard screaming from upstairs. Not human screaming, something higher pitched, like machinery breaking down. The three of us worked together, cutting every cable we could find, smashing every piece of equipment we could reach. And one by one, the voices upstairs stopped calling our names. When we finally went back upstairs, we found them. Dozens of bodies scattered throughout the lodge, all wearing familiar faces but collapsed like empty suits. They looked like balloons that had been deflated, skin sagging where the internal structure had given way. Frank called it in on the radio, and within 6 hours, the place was crawling with federal agents. They relocated all three of us to different states with new identities. I can't tell you my real name or where I live now, but I can tell you that Mirror Lake Resort was quietly demolished 6 months later. The official story was a gas leak explosion. I don't work maintenance ants anymore. I got an office job in a place where I never have to be alone in a building, never have to wonder if the person I'm talking to is really who they claim to be. And I avoid mirrors when I can. Sometimes when I catch my reflection off guard, I have to look twice to make sure it's really me looking back. They told us we'd stopped something that could have replaced thousands of people, maybe more. But I still wake up sometimes, wondering if we really got all of them. Wondering if somewhere out there, something is wearing my face and living my life better than I ever could. Looking back now, I think the scariest part wasn't the creatures themselves. It was how perfect they were getting at being us, how long they'd been practicing, how many people they'd already replaced before we noticed anything was wrong. I still get postcards sometimes, forwarded through the federal program. They're from places I've never been, signed with names I don't recognize. But the handwriting looks familiar, and they all say the same thing: "Wish you were here." I'm 31 years old now, and I work as an insurance adjuster for Midwest Mutual. It's not glamorous work, but it pays the bills and keeps me busy enough that I don't think too much about what happened back in 2009. That was the year they sent me up to West Virginia to investigate what turned out to be the strangest case of my career. 8 people had died in the mountains near an abandoned coal town called Sinking Creek, and my company was looking at over $2 million in life insurance payouts. My job was simple: figure out what killed these hikers so we could process the claims and move on. The thing about insurance work is you see a lot of weird stuff. People die in all kinds of ways, and usually there's a logical explanation once you dig into the details. But this case was different from the start. The local sheriff, a guy named Patterson who'd worked those mountains for 20 years, flat out refused to escort us into the area. He kept talking about territorial disputes and warning us to stay out of certain zones. When I pressed him for details, he just shook his head and said the state police could handle it from here. I wasn't going in alone, though. The company had put together a whole team for this one. There was Tom, our forensic photographer, who was maybe 29 and knew his way around a camera better than anyone I'd ever worked with. Lisa was our medical examiner. She was 34 and had seen enough bodies to know when something didn't add up. And then there was Jake, our security guy. He was only 26, but he'd done some military time, and the company liked having someone armed when we went into remote areas. Looking back now, I'm grateful they sent him along. Sinking Creek had been a proper coal town until 1987, when the last residents finally gave up and moved away. The mine had played out years before, but some families hung on until the very end, hoping that things might turn around. They never did. By the time we got there in late October, nature had been reclaiming the place for over 20 years. Houses still stood, but vines covered most of the walls and trees grew right through some of the roofs. The old school building looked like something out of a ghost story, and the church at the center of town had lost half its steeple to a storm years back. What struck me first wasn't how empty it felt, but how divided. Even before we started finding the bodies, it was obvious that different parts of town belonged to different things. The eastern neighborhood had this thick, musky smell that made your eyes water. The western side smelled different, sharper, more metallic. And the boundaries between these areas were marked as clear as property lines. Scratch marks on trees, piles of rocks that looked deliberate, and smells so strong you could taste them in the air. Tom started taking pictures right away, documenting everything we found. That's when we discovered the caches. Someone, or something, but had been storing pieces of the dead hikers in different houses throughout the town. The Eastern Pack, if you want to call them that, had claimed 3 houses near the old general store. The Western group had taken over 5 buildings closer to the main road. Each cache was different, like each group had their own way of handling food storage. The Eastern ones were neater, more organized. The Western caches were just brutal. Bones scattered everywhere, like they didn't much care about keeping things tidy. Lisa examined what was left of the victims, and she kept shaking her head. "These wounds don't match anything in my experience," she told us that first afternoon. "They're too clean for bear attacks, too savage for human weapons. And look at this." She showed us bite marks on a femur bone. "These jaw measurements, they're huge, but the tooth pattern is all wrong for any animal I know." That's when Jake found the den in the basement of the old schoolhouse. We'd been hearing sounds all day: scratching, movement, low rumbles that seemed to come from underground. The basement door was wedged shut with debris, but when we finally got it open, the smell that came out nearly knocked us over. It was like a zoo mixed with a morgue. There were sleeping areas made from torn clothing and pine branches, and clear signs that something had been raising young down there. Multiple somethings, actually. The scratch marks on the concrete walls went up at least 8 feet, and they were deep enough that whatever made them had serious claws. We were still documenting the basement when we heard the first howl. It came from the eastern part of town, long and low, and nothing like any wolf I'd ever heard. More howls answered from the west, and suddenly the whole town felt like it was waking up around us. Jake pulled his weapon and started scanning the windows of the nearby buildings. "We need to get to higher ground," he said. "Now!" The church seemed like our best option. It was centrally located and had good sight lines in all directions. We made it inside just as the Eastern Pack started moving. I got my first real look at them through the broken stained glass windows, and I still have nightmares about what I saw. 4 creatures, each about 6 or 7 feet tall, moving on 2 legs but wrong somehow. Too muscular, too coordinated, like they'd been built for hunting in packs. They communicated with short, guttural calls and hand signals that looked almost military in their precision. But before they could reach us, the western pack emerged from the abandoned houses near the main road. 7 of them, larger than the eastern group and led by something that had to be 8 feet tall. What happened next was like watching a nature documentary about wolves, except these things used rocks and broken glass as weapons. They fought with a brutality that was both intelligent and savage, coordinating their attacks while still giving in to pure animal fury. The eastern pack was outnumbered and outmatched. They fought hard, but the western group's leader, this massive thing with scars covering its torso, eventually drove them off toward the tree line. We watched from the church as the victors claimed the entire town, marking their new territory with scent and sound. That's when it hit me that we were now trapped in the middle of their expanded hunting ground. Jake had brought flares along with his service weapon, and he used one to create a distraction while we made our run for the vehicles. The creatures were so focused on their territorial expansion that they barely noticed us at first. But as we reached the parking area where we'd left our cars, the pack leader spotted us. It let out a howl that seemed to shake the ground, and suddenly all 7 of them were moving in our direction. That's when the helicopters showed up. Black military choppers, 3 of them, coming in low and fast over the tree line. The sound of their rotors sent the creatures scattering for cover, but not far. Men in tactical gear fast roped down into the town center, carrying equipment I didn't recognize. Tranquilizer guns, from the look of it, but bigger than anything you'd use on regular animals. A man in civilian clothes approached us as the military team moved through the town. He showed us credentials that identified him as Federal Wildlife Management, though I suspected that wasn't the whole truth. "You folks need to come with us," he said. "This area is about to be classified as environmentally hazardous." The next few hours were a blur of debriefings and paperwork. They had us sign non-disclosure agreements thicker than phone books and made it clear that discussing what we'd seen would result in federal prosecution. The creatures, they told us, were being relocated to a research facility where they could be properly studied. The town of Sinking Creek would be permanently closed to civilian access. Our insurance claims were marked resolved, confidential, and the families of the victims were told their loved ones had died due to hazardous environmental contamination. $2 million in payouts, and not one word of the truth. I still work in insurance, but I've never taken another case in West Virginia. Tom transferred to a different company within a month, said he couldn't get those photographs out of his head. Lisa retired early and moved to Florida. Jake went back to the military and last I heard was working private security overseas. The official story is that Sinking Creek was contaminated by old mining chemicals and is too dangerous for human access. There are warning signs posted all along the access roads now, and the state police actually do patrol the area to keep people out. But sometimes, late at night when I can't sleep, I wonder if those things are still out there somewhere. And I wonder if they remember the taste of human flesh, or if they've learned to hunt in places where there aren't any government helicopters to interrupt their feeding. I don't talk about this much. Hell, I've never told the whole story to anyone before now. But every time I see a missing hiker report from the Appalachian region, I can't help but think about pack territories and the sound of coordinated howling in the darkness. Some things you just don't forget, no matter how hard you try. I was 26 when this happened, working as a bank teller in Beckley, West Virginia. I'd been putting in long hours, dealing with difficult customers, and honestly, I was burnt out. My college friends and I had this tradition of taking weekend hiking trips to decompress, and that October, I suggested we check out Eagle's Nest Falls. It's this waterfall about 2 hours south of town that we'd been meaning to visit for years. The group was the usual crew: Mike, who's an accountant and always worried about everything; Sarah, who works as a nurse and keeps us all grounded; Tom, a high school teacher with way too much energy; and Lisa, who was working retail at the time and needed the escape as much as I did. We'd been hiking together since college, so I figured this would be just another fun weekend in the mountains. The plan was simple enough. Eagle's Nest Falls is popular with tourists, but I'd read online about some unmarked trails that could get you to the waterfall without dealing with all the crowds and tour buses. We packed our usual gear: water, snacks, first aid kit, GPS devices, the works. Mike brought his fancy new hiking boots that he'd been bragging about for weeks. The weather forecast looked perfect: clear skies and mild temperatures. We met up early Saturday morning at my apartment, loaded everything into Tom's truck, and headed out. Everyone was in good spirits, joking around, making plans for where we'd grab dinner afterward. Sarah had brought her digital camera to document the trip, and Lisa was excited because she'd never seen the falls before. It felt like any other hiking adventure we'd done a dozen times. The first sign that something was off came when we reached the trailhead. The main parking area for the falls was packed, just like I'd expected, but the side road that was supposed to lead to the unmarked trail seemed wrong somehow. The GPS kept losing signal, which was weird because we'd used it in this area before without problems. Tom's truck radio started picking up static, and Mike's phone couldn't get any bars. We figured it was just the mountains interfering with the signals. Happens all the time out there. I remember Sarah mentioning that the air felt different, thicker maybe, but we all chalked it up to the elevation change. Looking back now, I wish we'd paid more attention to those early warning signs. We found what we thought was the right trail, marked only by a faded wooden post with some carved initials. The path looked legitimate enough, wide enough for single file, with recent footprints in the dirt. About 30 minutes in, this fog started rolling in from nowhere. The weather report had said nothing about fog, and it came down fast. Within 20 minutes, we could barely see 20 feet in any direction. That's when our GPS devices started acting up completely, showing us in the middle of blank space instead of on any marked trail. Mike, who always likes to take charge in situations like this, suggested we keep moving forward until the fog cleared. He said he could hear water running somewhere ahead, so we were probably close to the falls anyway. That's when Mike disappeared. He'd been walking about 10 feet ahead of the rest of us, calling back every few minutes to let us know he was still there. Then suddenly, nothing. We called his name, and there was no response. Sarah immediately went into nurse mode, organizing us into a search pattern, but the fog was so thick we could barely see each other. We spent 2 hours calling for him, retracing our steps, checking every direction we could think of. Tom kept insisting we should head back to the truck and call for help, but none of our phones were working, and honestly, we had no idea which direction the truck was anymore. Then Lisa Spee and audited him. He was standing at the edge of what looked like a cliff, maybe 50 feet away through the fog, perfectly still. We called his name, but he didn't turn around or acknowledge us at all. Sarah tried yelling that we'd been looking for him, but Mike just stood there like a statue. When we got closer, we could see his eyes were open, staring straight ahead into the fog. But it was like he couldn't hear us or see us. Tom waved his hands right in front of Mike's face. Nothing. But when Sarah said, "Mike, sit down," he sat. When I said, "Mike, stand up," he stood. It was like he'd turned into some kind of robot that only responded to simple commands. That's when we heard the whistling. It was coming from somewhere above us, high up on the cliff face. Not like someone whistling a tune, but more like, I don't know how to describe it exactly, like someone blowing through a hollow bone or a piece of wood. Sharp, piercing notes that seemed to cut through the fog. The moment that sound started, Mike turned and began walking toward it, ignoring everything we said. We tried to grab him, but he was stronger than usual, like he had some kind of unnatural determination. He walked right up to what looked like a sheer rock face and started climbing, using handholds that we couldn't even see in the fog. We followed as best we could, and that's when we saw it. This thing emerged from the fog on a ledge about 20 feet up. It was tall, maybe 7 feet, covered in thick, dark hair that looked almost like fur, but the proportions were wrong. The arms too long, the legs too thick, the head too small. It was holding something to its mouth, and when it blew into it, that whistling sound echoed down to us. Mike immediately stopped climbing and stood perfectly still on the rock face, waiting for the next command. The creature made a different whistling pattern, and Mike continued climbing until he reached the ledge and stood next to it like an obedient dog. Sarah grabbed my arm so hard I still have the bruise marks. "That's not natural," she whispered. "It's conditioned. Gee them somehow. Like Pavlov's dogs, but with sound instead of bells. That's when we looked around and realized Mike wasn't the only one up there. There were other people standing on various ledges along the cliff face, all perfectly still, all waiting for instructions from the whistling. Men and women of different ages, some in hiking gear, some in clothes that looked like they'd been up there for weeks or months. All of them staring straight ahead with the same blank expression Mike had. We tried everything we could think of. Tom attempted to climb up after Mike, but every time he got close, the creature would whistle a different pattern and Mike would move further away along the ledge. Lisa threw rocks to try to distract the thing, but it didn't even look at us. It was like we didn't exist unless we responded to the whistle commands. Sarah figured out that we could block our ears with torn pieces of our shirts, and as long as we couldn't hear the whistle clearly, we stayed in control of ourselves. But that meant we couldn't help the people who were already up there, including Mike. Then we saw two more of them. They came out of the fog from different directions, both carrying similar bone whistles, working together like they were herding livestock, which I realized with horror is exactly what they were doing. These weren't random disappearances or attacks. This was organized, systematic. They were collecting people and keeping them compliant with those whistles, probably for reasons I didn't want to think about. Sarah confirmed what we were all afraid to say out loud. They're breeding them. That's why there are men and women up there. They're being kept like cattle. I still don't know where I got the courage, but I made a decision that probably saved all our lives. While Lisa created a distraction by yelling and throwing rocks from one side, I snuck around to where the nearest creature was standing. When it leaned down to whistle at the people on the ledges, I jumped up and grabbed the bone whistle right out of its hands. The thing made this awful shrieking sound and tried to grab me, but I was already backing away with the whistle in my hand. Sarah took it from me and immediately started experimenting with different combinations of notes. The first few attempts just made the controlled people move around randomly, but then she hit on something that worked. One by one, they started climbing down from the ledges, including Mike. The creatures were getting more agitated, making those shrieking sounds and moving around frantically, but without their whistle system, they couldn't maintain control over their captives. We managed to get everyone down, 8 people total, including our group. Some of them had been up there for what looked like weeks, judging by their condition. Sarah's nursing training kicked in, and she started checking everyone for injuries while the rest of us helped them walk. The creatures followed us for a while, but they seemed to have territorial boundaries. Once we got a certain distance down the mountain, they stopped pursuing us and just watched from the ridgeline. The fog cleared up as soon as we got away from that area, and our GPS devices started working again. We found the main trail and made it back to the parking area just as the sun was setting. We called 911, and the rescue teams found the others we'd brought down from the cliffs. Everyone survived, but most of them had no memory of how they'd gotten up there or how long they'd been missing. Mike was the same way. He remembered walking ahead of us in the fog, but everything after that was blank until he found himself walking down the trail with us. The authorities investigated, but they never found any evidence of the creatures or the bone whistles. The area was officially closed off to hikers, and they put up new signs warning about dangerous conditions and unstable cliff faces. Those of us who were there that day formed a kind of support group. We meet every few months just to check in with each other and make sure everyone's doing okay. I still work at the bank, but I haven't been hiking since that day. None of us have, actually. Mike moved to Virginia Beach, said he needed to be near the ocean where he could see for miles in every direction. Sarah switched to working in pediatrics because she couldn't handle adult patients who reminded her of the blank expressions we saw on that cliff. Tom quit teaching and started working construction. Lisa moved back in with her parents. Sometimes I still hear whistling in my dreams, and I wake up with the urge to walk outside and keep walking until someone tells me to stop. To this day, I keep earplugs in my nightstand, just in case.